Everyone's birth reorg, and I'm here, and this is my review for Eddington, the new film directed by Ari Aster, and starring Joaquin Phoenix, Pedro Pascal, Luke Grimes, Deirdre O'Connell, Michael Ward, Emma Stone, and also Austin Butler in the lead roles. Now, Ari Aster has made a name for himself as a horror movie auteur. He started off his career with what many consider as one of the scariest movies of the last decade or so, with Hereditary, then followed it up with another beloved horror movie in Midsommar, and then followed that up with what I thought was a pretty decent film, but a lot of people were kind of divisive about, Beau's Afraid, which is not a full-on horror movie, but it felt like 3 movies in one. Now, Eddington also feels like a lot of movies in one. Now, Eddington happens to be a contemporary Western. It also happens to be a historical period piece now, because technically this movie is chronicling what happened in 2020 with the COVID virus and all the things that were happening during that summer, which is kind of insane that we're already doing period pieces on the COVID era. Time just really flies. It's insane. This also happens to be a thriller. It also happens to be a political drama. It also happens to be a movie that is pretty much a human drama as well, and tinges of horror, but not in the regular way that you think about horror movies. Eddington, I feel like, is a lot of things, but it doesn't really land itself on those things. The trailer kind of highlighted the fact that this movie was going to be this kind of like political power play against Joaquin Phoenix's character and Pedro Pascal's character. And we get those sequences here. Those are pretty much the Western sequences where they're kind of like, you know, battling out each other in terms of the political landscape that they're trying to forge in this small town. And to be honest with you, those scenes were pretty decent. I felt like that's where Ari Aster was really zoned in. But I feel like the rest of this movie is a little bit too confused and a little bit too unsure as to what it's trying to be. Now, within the story of Eddington, there's a lot of things talked about. And that might be a little bit too much for people, because it feels like Ari Aster wants to talk about so much things that were happening during the respective year of 2020. Now, overall, the story of this film is revolving around COVID, the restrictions that happened during COVID, and how people were for or against the mask protocols, the distancing, and pretty much how people wanted things to go back to normal, or people were trying to adjust to the new normal before everything was going to get back to normal after the protocols and, you know, the restrictions were going to be lifted later on. The film is also talking about a lot of things that happened during the summer of 2020, especially the George Floyd passing, and also the protests that happened after George Floyd had passed. And Antifa is talking about the political divide that was happening during that summer and pretty much the rest of that year and pretty much until now. It's also talking about, you know, things were happening with people in terms of maybe being a little bit performative or being truthful in terms of what they were believing in, and so on and so on and so on. There's a lot of things being talked about here. And for some people, this might be a little bit too much, because I feel like Ari Aster, even though, you know, it's very interesting that he was talking about all these things that were happening during 2020, I feel like he was getting a little bit too carried away with like touching upon all these subjects. I feel like if he had focused on one thing, maybe this film would have been a little bit more zeroed in and a little bit more cohesive. Also, this film touches upon conspiracy theories and, you know, how people's minds were kind of like changing, how people were thinking like, oh, if this happened, then that means all these other things are happening, causing correlation, I guess. But yeah, I feel like because Eddington is this like jam-packed film, I feel like Ari Aster should have made this into a mini-series of sorts. I feel like if they had focused on all these subjects with each episode, maybe this would have been a little bit better. This film's a little bit long, with 2.5 hours in terms of running time, but I feel like even within that long length, they don't really cover everything in a proper manner. When it comes to Ari Aster, I feel like he's borrowing a little bit of Beau's Afraid and inserting it into this movie, but in a different manner. Now, when it comes to Joaquin Phoenix's character, he's not exactly the same as he is in Beau's Afraid, but the fragile masculinity that he had in that movie is kind of carried over into this film too. And because of that fragileness, he becomes a villain that is very calculated and a little bit maniacal in the second half of this film. And I felt like his arc was very interesting and kind of disturbing as to how far he would go in order to get things done in a certain way. Now, the last half hour of this movie feels like if Ari Aster was asked to make a GTA, a Grand Theft Auto type of film. Is it really good in that kind of manner? I felt like Beau's Afraid's first third is kind of relative to the last half hour of this movie, but I felt like in Beau's Afraid that he did a way better job of showing the anxiety-inducing kind of situation that the character is in, and the kind of thriller aspects that would come along with the characters not knowing what's happening and trying to survive and just trying to avoid a certain situation. Here, it feels like, again, it feels like a Grand Theft Auto kind of situation, and also it kind of felt like a commentary towards gun control and maybe karma as to what Joaquin Phoenix's character had done in the last, hour before that last half hour. But again, I feel like there was a lot of things happening there. Overall, I feel like Eddington, again, I give it a 6.5 out of 10. I feel like technically is a very solid film. The performances are very solid. Again, if he had focused on one thing, if he had focused on just the political aspects of this movie, maybe this movie would have been a little bit better. If he focused on the Western aspect of, Joaquin Phoenix and Pedro Pascal facing off each other in this kind of like standoff political kind of situation, maybe this movie would have been a little bit better. But I feel like because he inserted so much different storylines and so much different things into this film, I feel like he wanted to say so much, but unfortunately there's no landing whatsoever in terms of the story by the end of the movie. And by the end of the movie, I kind of felt like things just happened and he just wanted to say why these things had happened, but there's no correlation as to what the overall message was when he started this film. I said a lot of things, but yeah, I wonder what you all think, because again, Ari Aster has deviated from his previous films with this movie, and I appreciate that, but I feel like this could have been a little bit better if it were a miniseries, or if it had zoned in into a certain aspect of storytelling. But yeah, Eddington is a 6.5 out of 10. I would say out of the big releases that have come out this weekend, in comparison to I Know What You Did Last Summer, Eddington was probably the better of the two. But yeah, it's okay. I guess it's not as great as its other films, but it was decent.